Ni wakati mwingine tena, msikilizaji mpendwa wa idhaa ya Al-Shifa Online TV, vile vile na mwanafunzi mpendwa popote ulipo, na natumai pia umeweza kufurahia chakula chako cha mchana kwa siku ya leo. Baada ya mapumziko mafupi, tutakuwa tunaendeleza ule mchakato mzima wa elimu, na kama utapata fursa ya kuweza ama unipatie fursa tu dakika mbili niweze kukukumbusha lengo na dhamira ya mchakato huu ni gani. Kwanza kabisa, kama unavyotazama katika hii chati ya mabodi, ni kwamba maisha bora project kwa yatima, kitengo cha elimika project, ambapo hii ni dhamira ya yatima, yani kumaanisha yatima ndiye aliyelengwa ama ni mlengwa mkuu wa kupata elimu hii. Na vile vile pia hatujaacha nyuma wanafunzi wengine, bado kama mwanafunzi yule unapata fursa ya kuweza kuelimika kuhusiana ama kutokana na walimu wenye tajriba ya hali ya juu. Bila kusahau ya kuwa kitengo hichi washirika wakuu ni Al-Shifa Muslim Youth Initiative wakishirikiana na Al-Shifa TV, Radio Salam na ofisi ya seneta wa Mombasa Muhammad Faki. Na sitaki nipoteze muda, nikumbushe tu haraka upesi, kwa majina ni Mishi Harun, na nimpishe mwenzangu ama nimpishe mwalimu ambaye ataweza kusukuma gurudumu zima la somo la Kiingereza ama somo la English, ambapo kwa yote ambaye ana fursa kuweza kusikiliza na kutazama, basi nakwambia uwanja ni wako, zidi kutoa damu.
Once again, dear listener and the pupil at home, welcome to today's lesson, and I'll be talking about, we're going to discuss English, and in today's lesson I'll be looking at parts of speech. I want to believe that way back where you are at home, you understand that English is made up of 8 parts of speech, namely noun, verb, pronoun, adverbs, adjectives, conjunctions, prepositions, and interjections. So in today's lesson, I'll basically be looking at adverbs, so that in our subsequent lessons we shall discuss the other various parts of speech. Now, first of all, we are going to start by defining what adverbs are, and I will simply say that these are parts of speech which actually say amplifies the meaning of a word, and after amplifying it, they thereby narrows it down to its application. What do I mean? In other words, that an adverb is actually a word that modifies a verb, an adjective, or another adverb in a sentence. So an adverb is a word that modifies a verb, an adjective, or another adverb in a sentence. So in order for you to be able to understand what we mean by modification of a verb, an adjective, or another adverb in a sentence, we're going to remind ourselves about what a verb is. And we're saying that a verb is a doing word or an action word in a layman's language. For example, run, walk, talk represents verbs. And then an adjective is a word that talks more about a noun in a sentence. And like I said earlier on, an adverb is what modifies a verb, an adjective, and another adverb in that particular sentence. So you realize that an adverb carries more weight, more than the other parts of speech that I've just mentioned in my earlier explanation. Now, for example, in a sentence situation, you want to illustrate how an adverb can be used in a sentence. Like in the following sentence, we say that the firefighters ran swiftly towards the oncoming vehicle. So in our sentence, the word swiftly has been used as an adverb. In this case, it is trying to show how the firefighters ran. How did they run? They ran swiftly. Now, in our subsequent discussions, you realize that we are going to look at the different types of adverbs, so that you'll see where the word or the adverb swiftly falls, because the adverbs are divided into different categories. And in our second sentence, or most probably before I go to the second sentence, the word or the adverb swiftly in this particular sentence here has been used to modify the verb in that particular sentence. And the verb there is what? The fighter. So we are talking about the firefighter ran swiftly towards the oncoming vehicle. So it has been used to modify a verb in that particular sentence. And then we also have another illustration in a sentence that says, he was carrying a very small child. He was carrying a very small child. So small here shows, very shows the adverb in this particular sentence. It is showing, or it is illustrating, or in that particular manner, it is trying to modify an adjective in that particular sentence. So he was carrying a very small child. The adjective here is the word small, because it is showing this particular, the nature of that particular child that was being carried. So in other words, dear listener or student at home, what we are trying to say in this particular case here, we are saying that adverbs in sentences answers questions like when. Adverbs answer questions like when, where, how. We're also talking about to what extent, for example. Now, when we talk about an adverb answering a question like where, examples of adverbs that may be used to illustrate a situation whereby they are answering the question where include adverbs like we have here, we have there, and remember when you're talking about there, we also have a pronoun there that is spelled as T-H-E-I-R. In this case, we are not talking about that one that is showing ownership, but you're talking about that one that is showing a place, for that matter. And then we have away, up, etc. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is that these particular adverbs here, there, away, up, are trying to answer the question where. So when somebody asks you a question, and in that particular question there is this particular interrogation or interrogatory remark of where, then you can use the adverbs like here, there, away, up to be able to illustrate your answer depending on the situation that that particular question is handling at that particular moment. And then to answer the question when in a sentence, we use adverbs like now, then, later, soon, or you can talk about early, etc. So if somebody comes up with a question and inside it there is an interrogatory adverb when, you can use adverbs like now, then, later, soon, early, among others, to be able to answer that particular question. Now, to answer the question how often, when you're talking about how often, you're trying to show an extent to which a situation or a scenario takes place. For example, maybe you are somebody who likes playing football or any other game for that matter. So if somebody asks you how often you play that particular game, you can tell that person that if you do it on frequent situations, you can talk about frequently. If it is about a situation whereby you don't do it most of the time, you can talk about rarely. If you don't do it at all, you can say hardly. There are situations or scenarios you can use scarcely or even barely. So the words frequently, rarely, hardly, scarcely, or barely are examples of adverbs that are used in a question to answer the question in a sentence, to answer the question how often. And then to answer the question how, like I've illustrated in the other examples of situations whereby you are trying to use different adverbs, when you want to answer the question how in a sentence, you can use examples of adverbs like clearly, slowly, brightly, or you can say quietly. So in other words, you are trying to illustrate or you are trying to show how you do an activity. For example, if you are walking, you want somebody or somebody saw you walking and this person wants to suggest the manner in which you are walking. This person can say that Abdallah was walking slowly. So the word or the adverb slowly answers the question how. It shows the way you are trying to do something in that particular situation. Now, up to this particular extent, we have just looked at the different varieties of questions that you can meet that requires you to use different adverbs to be able to answer them. Now, at this particular case, we now want to look at the different types of adverbs in English. And adverbs are broadly categorized or divided into 5. We want to look at the different types of adverbs that are found in English. The ones that you will realize later on that we have actually highlighted them in our earlier discussion. So the types of adverbs. A, we have adverbs of manner. B, we have adverbs of degree. C, we have adverbs of frequency. D, We also have adverbs of time. Adverbs of time. And lastly, we can talk about adverbs of place. So there are different adverbs or types of adverbs that we are going to look at in our today's lesson. So like I've said, there are 5 of them. We are going to look at each one of them as we discuss downwards. Let us begin by looking at the adverbs of manner. Now, if you can be able to remember very well, as I was talking about the different types of questions that can be able to come your way, and then you use the different adverbs to answer them, you realize that I talked about the question that has how in it. You answer that question by showing how an activity was done. So in that particular case, when you're talking about adverbs of manner, these are actually words that tell how an action is being done, are words that tell how an action or an activity is done. When we're talking about an activity, now we are going back to a verb in that manner. Now, it is either done, was done, or will be done. Is done when you're talking about the present tense, was done when you're referring to the past tense, or will be done, will, when you're talking about the future tense. Now they answer the question how, like I've said earlier on, because you can remember in my earlier illustration, I had actually talked about the different questions that you can meet and their corresponding answers depending on that particular question. So we had looked at how. So when you're talking about adverbs of manner, in this case, like I said, they are trying to show how an activity is done. An example is clearly, and I'll give some illustrations in a sentence. Slowly, quickly, quietly, assiduously, etc. So the different examples I've given on there on the illustration board are trying to show the manner in which an activity was done. For example, you can say, Robert laughed happily. So in this particular sentence, the word happily represents an adverb of manner. It is trying to show us how Robert laughed. Laughed in this case becomes now the what? The verb. That is why you go back to our definition and it tells you that an adverb actually tells us or modifies a verb, a noun, or another adverb in a what? I mean an adjective or another adverb in a sentence. So how did Ngeno laugh? So in this case, or how did Robert laugh? In this case, you answer by saying that Robert laughed happily. So happily becomes the adverb of manner. Example 2, you can say, he closed the door quietly. So who closed the door? We don't know the person who closed the door. But you are being told how this particular person closed that particular door. So how did he close it? He closed the door quietly. So quietly now becomes the adverb of what? The adverb of manner in that case. Then the word closed here represents the verb, showing the activity that was done by this particular person. And the object now becomes the door that was done what? Was closed by that particular person. And then, secondly, we are going to look at the adverbs of time. Adverbs of time. Now, adverbs of time, they either show or tell us when an action was done, or you can say was, is, or will be done. What do I mean by was? Was, because I'm referring to the past when that particular action was done. Is, I'm talking about the present because it is the verb in the present tense. And will represents the future. So you're trying to illustrate how this activity, or when this activity was done, at what particular time was it done. When you talk about was, then it was done in the what? In the past. Is, you're talking about it happening in the present. And will, you're actually talking about what will happen in the future. So, for example, and in this case, you realize that they answer the question, when. So, adverbs of time answer the question, when. So, when I say when, I mean in a scenario or a situation whereby a question contains when in it, you can easily answer it using the different adverbs of time here to show when that particular activity was done. For example, I'll want to talk about the past. So I'll talk about yesterday. So yesterday now becomes the time that particular activity was done. So you've not specified at what time was it done, that particular yesterday. But now the word yesterday here shows the time that that particular activity was done. You can talk about today. You can talk about tomorrow. You can equally say later, or even soon. So all these are examples of adverbs that are trying to show the time that these particular activities were done. Or you can even say lately. So they all illustrate the different timings in which activities are done, and therefore answering the question, when. So let me give an example sentence to show how we use the adverbs of time, so that you can be able to understand this particular situation very well and apply it in your day-to-day activities. So for example, you can say, the film on the set book Aminata will be shown tomorrow. So in this case, tomorrow becomes the adverb of time. It is trying to answer the question when this particular film of the set book that we are calling Aminata will be shown. So when will it be shown? It will be shown tomorrow. That one is just an example of a sentence showing how we can be able to use the adverb of time. Or you can say, maybe in another example sentence, soon he will get a cultural shock. Soon he will get a cultural shock. In this particular case, the word soon here represents the adverb of time. So who is this who will get the cultural shock? And what about this cultural shock? We don't know about the cultural shock. What are we doing here? Or what are we trying to say here? We are trying to illustrate that this particular situation that is going to happen to this particular time will be, this particular person, will be taking place soon. And when you're talking about soon, it means it's not a time that is very far from this particular moment that I'm speaking. And then we can also talk about another example of the president recently lifted the lockdown. The president recently lifted the lockdown. So the word recently here shows the adverb of time, showing or trying to tell us or trying to answer the question when this particular lockdown was lifted by the who? By the president. So in this particular case here, I've just used 3 examples to show the different adverbs of time and how you can be able to apply them in different sentences and use them in your day-to-day activities. Now we have looked at 2 different types of adverbs. Now we want to go to the 3rd type of adverb that we are calling, that is adverb number C or number 3, and I'll call it adverb or adverbs of frequency. Adverbs of frequency. Earlier on, during the illustration of my different examples, when I was introducing this particular topic, I had talked about how often an activity takes place or an action takes place. So when you're talking about adverbs of frequency, these are examples of words that answer the question, how often or how often. So frequency is that the rate at which something happens. For that matter, you can say so. For example, you can say always, rarely, seldom, continually, once, usually, etc., etc. So these are examples of words that are trying to show how often an activity is done. So you can say, for example, he always come to school late. So you're talking about somebody who lies coming to school late. It has been his habit or a habit that this particular person rarely comes to school early. So because it is now his manner or his way of doing things, we now say that this person always comes to school late. So the word always here has been used as an adverb of frequency. It is trying to show us the way this person does every other time. What does he do? That he usually comes to school late, isn't it? And then, for example, you can also say in another sentence, my father rarely forgets. So you're talking about that particular father of yours who is always up to date with everything that happens. So that when something happens, no matter how quiet you keep about that particular thing, this particular person will never forget it. So that after time goes or and reminds you of that particular thing. So you are like, how did he remember this particular thing? It is because He rarely. So the word rarely here is an adverb of frequency that shows the manner in which your father will always remember something. So he rarely forgets something when maybe you discuss it, or when maybe he says, or he gives out something or order. So he doesn't forget that particular thing easily. And then the inmates, when you go to Shimo la Tewa, so inmates are the people who are in prison. They have been jailed. So we're talking about the inmates hardly work unless when supervised. And this is actually true, because if you take a case study of, for example, a prison somewhere where we have prisoners, they have been given a piece of work to be able to do. Rarely will you find these particular people doing that particular activity. Now I'm talking about rarely, and yet in my sentence I have used hardly. So why am I using these two different adverbs here? In my illustration, it means when I say that the inmates, you'll find out that the inmates rarely, because most of the time they don't do that particular activity. So, but in my example I've said they hardly work unless. So rarely is because I'm reporting that particular activity. But when you're talking about that activity that these prisoners now do, the way they do it, you say that the inmates hardly work unless when supervised. So it means there has to be a prison warden there so that they can be able to do what? To do that particular work. Not unless this particular person is there, they will not do that particular work. So hardly is actually an adverb of frequency that shows that something will never be done, not unless there is a certain condition that prevails so that that particular thing is done what? Is done. And then another example, you can say, our head teacher has often told us to be disciplined. And that one is obvious because schools are meant to propagate for discipline. So if you find a head teacher who is not propagating for discipline, then that one is not a good head teacher. So you're talking about a head teacher who often reminds you of what? Of discipline. So the word often here shows that whenever this particular head teacher speaks, our head teacher often reminds us of discipline. So it means that every other time that this particular head teacher is addressing you, he must always talk about discipline. And we say that discipline, as you know very well, carries a lot of things with it. So that one is also another example sentence where we have used the word often, or often, as you may like to pronounce it, to show that this one is a frequency. Most of the time, a repeated thing. When you're talking about frequency, we are talking about repetition. Something that is done most of the time. So that is why we say that these are words that answers the question, how often. And then lastly but not least, let us look at adverbs of place. Adverbs of place. Now when you're talking about adverbs of place, remember when I was introducing this particular topic on adverbs, I had talked about the question or the examples of adverbs: where, when, how often, to what extent. So adverbs of place are actually answering the question where. So they answer the question where. So where to mean a place where this particular activity takes place, for example, which in this particular case, when you're talking about where, you may not necessarily mention the place or the name of that particular place, but you can mention, for instance, you can say down, examples. You can say then, there. So when you're talking about there, you are not specific. You're not trying to mention the name of that particular place, but you're actually showing that it is somewhere. So this person may know the place. When you're talking about a situation saying saying there, you may be talking about a situation whereby the person you're talking to knows that particular place very well. So there's no need of you actually mentioning the place. But in other instances, you can equally mention the name of that particular what? That particular place. So up, down, Kisumu, Nairobi. So you are mentioning what? Places. For example, you can say, there is a book. Now in this case, you might not see the essence of the use of what? The adverb of place, there. So this comes into use when somebody asks you, where is the book? So you illustrate by saying that the book is there. So there is the book. Now this particular case here, there can be placed in different places in this particular sentence. You can equally say, the book is there. Or you say, there is a book. It depends with how you are going to frame that particular question. That is why you realize that adverbs of place can be moved from one position in a sentence to another. But usually, they appear at the end of the sentence in most cases. But in this case, I've used it at the beginning of the what? Of the sentence. So there is a book. You don't say there is a book. No. You say there is a book. So meaning that you're trying to illustrate the place where that particular book is. They met abroad. And now this is a case whereby the pupils or the students are actually supposed to be very keen. Because like I said, when you're talking about the adverbs of place, they are flexible. They can be placed anywhere, in any position, in a what? In a sentence. Like in this case, I've said, they met abroad. So abroad now becomes the place. You can equally change this abroad and put it at the beginning of the what? At the beginning of the sentence. Now, for example, you can say, in this particular case, you can also give another sentence, example sentence by and say that the birds flew away. So I'm using this sentence because I want to illustrate the different places this particular adverb of place, away, can be put in a sentence. You can equally paraphrase this sentence and say that away the bird flew. Away the bird flew. So in the first instance, the adverb of place, away, has been placed at the end of the sentence. And in the second situation, the adverb of place, away, has now been placed at the beginning of the what? Of the sentence. That is why I said earlier on that the adverbs of place are the very specific adverbs in English that can be able to take different positions in a what? In a sentence. And then lastly, I'll wind up my lesson by looking at the adverbs of degree. You can remember I had actually mentioned that there are 5 different types of what? Of adverbs. Now the last adverb here is the adverbs of what? Of degree. And the adverb of degree actually indicates the extent, to which an activity is done, or something happens for that matter. So they answer the question, to what extent? Because if you can remember very well, in my earlier introductory remarks, I'd actually talked about the different questions that are going to be asked about this particular case. For example, as I wind up, Nina, who happens to be a person, is definitely coming with you. So the word definitely here is actually showing the degree, the extent, that when you are coming, you should remember that Nina will be doing what? Will be accompanying you. So Nina is definitely coming with you. So it is a statement that has already been stated, that you should know at the end of it all that when you are going to go, Nina will be doing what? Will be coming with you. Now, I'll take this particular opportunity to thank you, the dear listeners and observers at home, the pupils and the parents who are actually observing, for having taken your time to actually listen to me during this particular session. In our subsequent lessons, we are going to also look at the other different parts of speech that I've mentioned in detail as we continue with this particular lesson onwards. Actually, thank you very much.
Asante pia wewe mwalimu Mr. Bashir Ali kwa somo lako hilo la Kiingereza, ambayo pia natumai mwanafunzi mpendwa pale nje pamoja na mtazamaji na msikilizaji ameweza kunufaika, kufaidika, kuelimika. Mimi mwenyewe hapa binafsi awali nimeweza kufaidika na nashukuru Mungu, alhamdulillah. Na la zaidi, kuna wale yule ambao wamekosa masomo haya, lakini nakwambia kama mwanafunzi bado una nafasi nzuri ya kuweza kuelimika kupitia kurasa za Facebook. Kwanza kabisa una fursa kutembelea kurasa ya Facebook ya Al-Shufaa Muslim Youth Initiative. Alafu pia vile vile una fursa kuweza kutembelea kurasa za Facebook za Radio Salam Mombasa. Pale utaona katika yale masomo ya nyuma ambayo labda yamekupita na utaweza kufanya revision yako ya mara kwa mara. Kwa hivyo mtazamaji, tunakuambia kila kilicho na mwanzo hakikosi kuwa na mwisho. Na kufikia hapo basi ndio tufungasha virago na kuondoka. Mimi la zaidi nakwambia usikose kutembelea YouTube channel Al-Shufaa Online TV, na pia vile vile usikose kusubscribe na kuweka comment na mambo yakawa murwa kabisa. Bye bye.